Matthew 5:43 to 47. And this is from the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For God makes God's sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends ruin on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? And now a contemporary word from Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. Christianity has been almost sentimental in its effort to deal with hatred in human life. It has sought to get rid of hatred by preachments, by moralizing, by platitudinous judgments. It has hesitated to analyze the basis of hatred and to evaluate it in terms of its possible significance in the lives of the people possessed by it. This reluctance to examine hatred has taken on the character of a superstition. It is a subject that is taboo unless there is some extraordinary social crisis, such as war, involving the mobilization of all the national resources of the common life to meet it. There is a conspiracy of silence about hatred, its function and its meaning. And now a contemporary word from an interview with Robert Thurman. I'm thrilled to imply a link between Buddha and Jesus, showing their commonality. Jesus' own statement of love thine enemies is negated, really, by our modern materialistic psychology. Buddhism has a psychology that is usable within whatever religious framework. Jesus himself, because of the social circumstances in his culture, was only able to teach for 4 years. The Buddha had time to provide more practical methodologies to underlie these sort of high moral sounding slogans like love your enemy. And there can be such a thing as tough love, or in Tibetan, fierce compassion. And so the psychology of love your enemies does not just mean come and trample us, come kill me, my enemy. It means I want you to be happy. I'm going to be happy no matter what. And it's better, you'll be happier if you don't kill me, actually. So, now we'll hear from Carol.
Nice to hear a chuckle there for the words of Robert Thurman. I got a chuckle myself as I was studying toward preparing this sermon on Love Your Enemies. And my chuckle was that Robert Thurman, one of the well-known American Buddhist scholars of our time, wrote with Sharon Salzberg, another Buddhist teacher, a book called Loving Your Enemies, based on Buddhist teachings. And so to see that both our Christian and our Buddhist scholars are talking about this topic was amusing to me. And of course, it was fun that Robert Thurman and Howard Thurman have the same last name. I don't know that there's any possible connection between the two, because Howard Thurman, as we mentioned last week, is an African-American theologian, minister, scholar, writer, poet, who was born in 1899 in Florida and died in 1981, and actually preached at least once in this church. He was a minister of the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco. And Robert Thurman was, as far as we know, European-American New Yorker who was not raised in any religious tradition particularly, but discovered Tibetan Buddhism as a young man and devoted his life to studying that tradition and practicing that tradition. So the fact that they have the name Thurman, I love that. I tried to track down, is there any possibility that they could be related? But the interwebs did not help me with that. But very much speaking to each other, very much speaking to this idea of love your enemies. Some people say it's one of the hardest Christian teachings, and it's certainly not one that we like to talk about a lot because it's very uncomfortable. Thurman, in his book, Jesus and the Dispossessed, last time we talked about his chapter on fear, well, his next chapter is on hatred, and that's where he takes up this question of loving your enemies. He tells us that he's going to take this question from the standpoint of those he calls the disinherited. These are people with their backs against the wall. These are the people who have been dispossessed by the structures of our society, by the cultural practices and leanings. These are people whose rights have been denied, whose access to the necessities of life has been constrained. And he writes specifically to African American people. But as Vincent Harding, who was a great student of Thurman, noted, if Thurman were alive in our time, he would talk about all the many peoples whose backs are against the wall. But in 1949, he was primarily writing from his own historical and cultural experience. But he notes that hatred emerges from a bitterness, from a resentment toward those who are imposing these structures upon the disinherited. And there's a lot of positive attributes of hatred because it gives a person a great energy, a great motivation to pursue justice or to pursue even the necessities of life. But Thurman tells us that ultimately hatred is not a kind actor in our psyches because it degrades us. Hatred takes from us our moral sense. It leads us to do things that our moral sense of what is right and wrong would not permit us to do toward other people. He says it's death to the spirit. He reminds us that Jesus rejected this hatred. Jesus said, love your enemies. And Jesus himself, as Thurman tells us, was speaking to the disinherited. He was not speaking to those of us who live the relatively privileged life of comfort where our place in the empire is assured, whether by our race or our economic background or our professions or whatever. So Jesus rejected hatred. We like sometimes to think that Jesus was special, that Jesus invented this teaching. But actually this teaching, in different words, is a thread that runs through Jewish teachings, and it also runs through the Greco-Roman philosophy of his time. And it's a kind of wisdom that runs through all the great traditions, including Buddhism. So Buddhism, as Robert Thurman reminds us, tells us that there's he gives us similar kinds of warnings about what happens when we cultivate hatred as opposed to love and compassion. Because indeed, the Buddhists have a whole system of psychology that contradicts much of what we know in Western psychology that urges us to be individualistic and competitive and look out for our own well-being. Buddhist psychology says that we are at our most human, we are at our best when we cultivate our compassion and care for others. Sounds familiar when we've been studying the teachings of Jesus. And for the Buddhists, compassion does begin with compassion toward oneself. And compassion toward oneself would not encourage us to cultivate hatred toward ourselves, which some of us have had practice in, or toward others. One thing Buddhism does teach is that it's not an either or, love your enemies or hate your enemies. That it's not easy to love your enemies. In Buddhism, loving your enemies means wishing them happiness. Compassion means wishing happiness for yourself, happiness for others. But in between that great frustration and disappointment and irritation and all the other things we might feel toward one who is perceived as an enemy, whether an enemy of the moment or an enemy in a larger sense, there is kind of a neutral ground where we can at least practice letting go of the hatred without compelling ourselves to try to love someone. I was remembering that when I was talking to my sister Rachel the other day about our current moment. And she said, I just don't know if I can go there to love your enemies. And I said, well, my prayer is for myself that I might be able to consider the option. And for both Thurman and for the Buddhists, this is the great teaching, that we have choices. We have choices in how we respond. We can choose to follow a momentary emotional impulse, and we can cultivate that, and we can fan the flames, and we can strategize, and we can seek ways to get retribution or vengeance or revenge. Or we can notice those feelings, and we can choose whether to follow those or whether to step back to those more primary teachings, the primary teachings to love that are throughout both Buddhist and Christian teaching. It's not easy to love your enemies. All the philosophical and religious traditions recognize that, and yet they all still instruct us that the way to freedom, the way to freedom of conscience, the way to freedom of choice as for our behavior, the way to freedom from suffering is indeed to cultivate that love within us, that compassion, that desire for others too to be freed from hatred. And I found this little quote from Plutarch, which I enjoyed. It says, having enemies in everyday life is normal, but you should use them to improve your own life. And this is, I think, perhaps our way into loving our enemies, is to go back to our own breath and our own thoughts and our own assumptions. What do we assume about other people? And to recognize that if we are able to set aside those momentary, Thurman liked to use the word passions, those momentary passions, if we are able to set those aside and to recognize the patterns that pass through us, the assumptions that we have adopted, if we are able to set those aside, that we can cultivate in our own depths a very different way of being. Because the cost of not loving our enemies is very high. It's very high. It erodes our self-regard, our conviction that we are called to be loving people. It erodes our capacity to choose. Because when we cultivate an attitude of anger or hatred or any of the corresponding attitudes that might be lumped in there, when we cultivate those, we reduce our own freedom of choice. So the invitation to transformation here is, it's not an invitation that is a momentary, now everything's all better kind of transformation. It's an invitation to practice. This is the way the Buddhists would talk about it, but so would Christians. It's an invitation to practice prayer. It's an invitation to practice awareness. It's an invitation to come back each time we notice we've gone off the track. It's an invitation to come back to this core and very challenging teaching. Love our enemies. Pray for those who persecute us. I cut it off the biblical passage, but the very last sentence of that chapter in Matthew says, "Be perfect like your Father in heaven is perfect." I didn't know that I would have anything to say about being perfect, except to confess that I am not there yet. But there's another way of understanding that word perfect, which is to be whole. That is, to find an integrity within ourselves, to find a way of aligning our deepest convictions, not only with our thoughts, but with our outward behavior. So that's our invitation, I think, to practice that awareness that we will have thoughts that contradict our intentions, and to learn to pause and recognize those thoughts, and to say, this is not a thought to cultivate, and to go back to those teachings that we can remember, such as love your enemies, again and again and again and again. I've been instructed 7 times 7, and again and again and again for the first 7. We'll remember this. Love your enemies. Amen.